Welcome to What You Really Need to Know. This is my new podcast, and I'm going to be doing this hopefully on a bi-weekly basis. I'm aiming for 2 shows a week, so we'll see how it goes. The first thing that I want to say is this is definitely going to have its own slant to it. This is not going to be an attempt to be unbiased. This is not going to be an attempt to be fair and balanced. This is going to be an attempt to tell you what you really need to know and the truth of what's going on in today's world. I plan to cover everything from election coverage to actual polling results to what's going on in the Middle East to what's going on around the world and anything else that I find interesting. It's going to be my podcast. It's going to have my slant, and if you don't like it, you're going to have to just get used to it or watch something else. So with that in mind, I want to start off with something interesting. Last night was, of course, the presidential primaries in Idaho, Utah, and Arizona. Obviously, there's been widespread allegations of voter fraud in the Arizona primary. Bernie Sanders won the Iowa caucus and, the Idaho caucus and the Utah caucus in landslide victories. Did I say last night was the Iowa caucus to begin with? I might have correction. Idaho, Utah, and Arizona voted last night. Bernie Sanders crushed it in both Idaho and in Utah. And there's been some very interesting information coming out of Arizona all day that the lines were miles long. Interestingly enough, the mainstream media called the election before most of the lines had even entered the polling stations. Now, it is well documented that Bernie does better with late deciders and that Bernie does better with people who are registering day of election. He also does better with young people who tend to vote at the last minute. Most young people in our generation don't know about absentee ballots. They don't know about early voter registration. They don't know about early voting. So most young people wait till the day of the election to vote. So I think it's safe to assume that Bernie was going to have the majority of the people who are lined up voting for him. So this was a deliberate attempt by W. Wasserman Schultz and the DNC to prevent more Bernie Sanders voters from voting. And let's also remember that this isn't about whether or not Bernie would have won the Arizona primary. The question is, by what margin would he have lost? Because this whole thing is done on proportional delegates. So had he lost 51-49, they split the delegates. Had he actually won 51-49, they split the delegates. But you see the point. The margin of victory is just as important, which is why people say if you're in line, keep standing in line, go vote, because actually this is one of the few times in American democracy where your actual vote does count. Every vote counts because the margin of victory counts. Winning Idaho and Utah by 80-20 was huge. Winning it by 60 points, those are huge victories, and huge victories. They mean a lot more than winning a state. Had he won the same states 60-40, it's a massive difference in delegates, and I'll get into that in a little bit because it's another thing that they're not covering in the mainstream media right now. In fact, they were deliberately giving misinformation on the mainstream media, and they were doing this because they knew that they could play a card of misspeaking before the results happen. So they'll never I shouldn't say they'll never deliberately lie to you. They will always deliberately lie to you, but they won't say something that is so obviously factually incorrect that they'll need to print a retraction or state a retraction. So what they do instead is they say something like this: well, Bernie Sanders is going to lose Arizona by so much that even when he wins the other 2 states, he is still going to come out behind on the delegate count, which is factually incorrect. But because they're making an assumption because they're saying that before Utah and Idaho had voted, it's not actually incorrect, because what they'll say is, well, we were working off the assumption of the polling numbers, which had him only winning by 10%. No one knew he was going to win by 60, and so therefore we were assuming it off of that data. So we weren't wrong, we just spoke too early. And the mainstream media is great at these things, but the main thing that they're doing is constantly fabricating a they're constantly creating what Noam Chomsky refers to as a manufacture of consent. It's constantly making you believe a certain narrative. So last night, the narrative on the mainstream media was that it was a bad night for Bernie. See, he lost Arizona. See, it doesn't matter that he's going to win these two small states because he's still going to lose on the delegates, yada, 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 yada. When in reality, if you actually go to the official delegate counter, and these are just mainstream media delegate counters, like you go to Bing.com, for instance, and they have a delegate counting thing right there on Bing's main page. You type in the candidate's name and they'll give you his delegates. So in Bernie Sanders' case. So here's the interesting part. Last night, the net result of that was actually a plus in delegates for Sanders, because as of right now, and this is 6 o'clock Eastern time, noon Hawaii time where I am, the count is currently, let's see, where are we at right now? Okay, I'm not pulling it up this second, and I don't want to be standing here on. But when I checked it about an hour ago, the stats were that they hadn't allocated all the delegates yet. Arizona, I believe, is a 76 delegate state. They'd allocated 67 of the delegates. Now that's the vast majority. I think Utah was a 26. They'd allocated 25, and Idaho was a 33. I may have those reversed, but anyway, it was within 4 delegates they'd already allocated them. Basically, Bernie had gotten all of the ones in Utah and all of the ones in Idaho. She had received 4 in one state and 5 in the other, and he'd received over 20 in the other, 24 in one and 20 in the other. Basically, giving him a net positive of, when all the calculations were done, he had a net positive of 31 delegates when you factor in Arizona, because it's proportional. So he actually won a considerable number of delegates in Arizona. She actually had a net increase in Arizona, but then he wiped the floor with her in the other 2 states, and she received so few delegates that in the end, the overall course of the night was that he got 31 delegates closer to her as of about 2 hours ago, and I think that margin will continue to hold true. He may gain a few more delegates, but basically you can assume it's somewhere between 30 and 35 delegates is what he increased, what he gained on her last night. Now, that's not a rousing victory. I mean, in Florida alone, she created more separation than that. But it does speak to a narrative, and this is counteracting the narrative in which you're listening to on the mainstream media constantly. So the narrative is he's losing. And see, they don't want to start a campaign. They don't want to start a momentum slide of he's winning, because that becomes dangerous. And it's actually going to become very tricky for them, because we know that next Saturday he's going to win 3 states. He's going to win Washington, he's going to win Hawaii, where I'm sitting, and he's going to win Alaska. And he's most likely going to win these states very large, and she's not going to have a win that night. Now, they're going to do their best to discredit the wins. They're going to say these are small states, these are small caucuses. Bernie always does better in the caucus states. She's still winning the big states, and she's ahead she's ahead in California, and she's ahead in New York. And they'll put a negative spin on everything. I mean, if you just read the headlines, right? This is the way, and remember, 70% of people only read the headline. They don't read the article. So these are the kind of headlines they run, Sanders staying alive helps Clinton stay in spotlight, tout foreign policy. That's Fox News, not surprising. No, Bernie Sanders rallies are not as violent as Trump's, the Huffington Post. So that sounds good on the surface, but they're linking violence to Bernie Sanders rallies, and you notice how that's a subliminal message. Bernie Sanders scrabbles to keep pace with Clinton. So that's, let's describe him as scrabbling rather than let's not give him any terms of gathering momentum. Let's see, Bernie Sanders, Bernie Sanders credits turnouts. Okay, so that's Denver Post, not surprising, they cover it a little better. Sanders credits turnouts for wins in Idaho and Utah. Let's see. and so it keeps. I'm going back now before the elections, but basically, it's just the narrative. You understand the narrative that the mainstream media is trying to project to us is that it's hopeless, to give up. And this is a deliberate attempt to reduce voter turnout. This is a deliberate attempt to bring down the amount of people who are going to come out to support, and they're trying their best to discourage young people. Now, one of the main things that they've continued to underestimate in this campaign is that young people do not get their information from the mainstream media. We get most of our information from Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, social media, our friends. We don't pay attention to many things. But a lot of what you see shared on your Facebook comes from certain outlets of the mainstream media, and because of this, they utilize their headlines. This is why the Washington Post ran 16 negative stories about Bernie Sanders in a 24-hour period. They're trying to establish this manufacture of consent, and it's something that we all have to be on the watch for, and it's something that we all have to observe closely, and it's something that we all need to understand is going on, and you have to read between the lines when you watch these shows. And I would just recommend turning them off altogether. Spend your time watching the Young Turks, watch other online sources of information. Get your information from ZNet, get your information from there's numerous online sources of better information. Get your news here. There'll be a lot more coming on this channel, but this is the first video of many in this series. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will do my best to keep you up to date on the likelihood of the outcomes of the election. On one side note that I think is fascinating, Nate Silver, who is a pretty well-respected centrist polling analysis expert, was tweeted at last night and asked by a Hillary Clinton supporter on the current pace that Hillary Clinton is at, when will she lock up the nomination? And Nate Silver tweeted back and said there is a very strong likelihood that she won't, which is very interesting, and again something that the mainstream media does not want you to know, that it requires winning about 59% of the total delegates and 59% of the vote to lock up the Democratic nomination. Now, she's on pace currently to do that, but the problem is the map has shifted against her. And so what Nate Silver's calculating is if she's going to lose 18 of the next 22 states, which, by the way, she's behind in the polls in 18 of the next 22 states. She's ahead in 4 of the largest, so she still stays on pace to keep her thing, unless we can switch California and we can switch New York to wins for the Sanders campaign. But she's not on pace to win by enough to lock up the nomination, which is fascinating because you see the mainstream media continually talking about how we're going to have a brokered convention or an open convention for the Republican Party and how they're going to try to steal it from Trump, and yet nobody's talking about the fact that on the Democratic side, there is a strong likelihood that Hillary Clinton is not going to get enough delegates to lock up the nomination, which is fascinating. And then another interesting side note on that is that if you're actually looking for someone who's strong enough to lock up the nomination, this goes to part of why to vote for the Sanders campaign, because he actually, the way the map is working right now, he is the more likely person to actually reach those number of delegates. Not saying it is likely, it's more likely to be open either way, but the interesting part is because the states like him, it's more likely he can win those states by larger margins than it's going to flip and the states are going to vote opposite what they're polling. It's more likely that the person who's leading is going to win by larger margins than it's going to flip, especially in the case of Sanders, because if you've noticed, he's never lost a lead in a state in which he's leading. Hillary only goes backwards in polls. She's never increased. She's never outperformed what she was supposed to do. And that actually holds true for every state she's won. She's never outperformed what she was polling at. And people will cite, well, she crushed him in Florida. Actually, he did 4% better than he was polling at in Florida. He did better. He had a net gain in almost every state that night that they deemed that he got crushed. He outperformed his polls. There was one poll that was in the margin of error, and they had him winning. I think it was Illinois or Ohio, one of the two, and they had it, and it was in the margin of error in the 2% range, which you can't really consider outdoing your polls. But it's a very fascinating subject to watch, the level at which the media has picked a horse in this race. And I think it's something that we all need to be aware of. And you have to ask yourself, if the media establishment is picking a horse and they're pushing this hard down our throats, what does that tell you? What does that tell you about the quality of the candidate that you're voting for? I know Hillary supporters will say, oh, she's a liberal, she's a progressive, but if she's liked by all these people, what do they know that you don't? Why does she get so much money from Goldman Sachs? Why is she taking so much money from Wall Street? Why is the mainstream media so supportive of her? What does that tell you? If the largest corporations on earth support a candidate, what is she doing for them? What is she going to do for them? What do they believe? And these are not stupid people. These people are very intelligent. And if they believe she's going to do something for them, you can bet your ass that she's going to do it. Anyway, that's all for today. Have a good one.